So this is, I guess, a somewhat controversial subject. I mean, I don't know that it should be really because, well, we are, I think, already in a world war. Um, Apart from calling it that, I guess. I think historically we're going to look back at this period in the early 2020s and think that that was the beginning of it. And I guess with if you just study historically World War One and Two, you're going to see that obviously it just didn't arise out of nowhere, even though there were trigger events, obviously, for, the wars in the past. I think we can look at that now as well. I'm going to show you lots of slides, lots of charts. I do think that we're in a world war, and I think even thinking like that might take the sting out of this a bit because World War Three, if we could call it that. I don't know if we'll ever call it that, but I don't think it's going to be like World War One or Two. I mean, I think that's obvious already. It's not going to be fought like that. It's going to be a different kind of warfare. We're already seeing that anyway with drones and all of that. But even apart from actual attacks, I think it's going to be different. I'm going to show you why I think it's going to be different as well, by the way, based on the signs that are involved. I think it's going to be more of a sort of an economic war than anything else. And you might say, well, isn't all war, about resource? Maybe, but I think this one is going to be fought in different ways, like cyber attacks and things like that, not just drone strikes, but cyber attacks and yeah, an economic war, if we can call it that, I guess. Apart from also obviously actual war and fighting, that's going to be something that we're going to see, obviously. And we'll see it increase and decrease over different periods over the next decade. I believe in the next decade, from this year 2024 until 2034, maybe. But certainly, I think by 2034, we're going to be on the other side of what we might call a world war. And I do think, though, and this is just for everybody who's tuning in, maybe, or watching the playback and is not patient enough to watch through the whole video and look at all the charts that I've got to show you. I do think, though, that there's going to be a somewhat lull by mid-decade in a way. There might be a push for peace. I'll show you why I think that is as well. But then it's also, I think, going to pick up and escalate by the end of the decade. And by 2029, 2030, I think we're heading into what we would then probably call World War. I really don't like saying this, and I really hope I'm wrong. I really do, obviously. But like I said, I don't think it's going to be like World War One or Two. So we can at least take that from it, that it's going to be fought very differently. And also then there's the other side of this, because if I am seeing the kind of astrology that we saw in both world wars, but we're also seeing the advancements in technology and different kinds of movements on the planet that we just didn't have back then. And that's not to say, by the way, that we're such civilizations right now that we wouldn't go in that way. Of course, we're not anyway civilized compared to any period in history, really. We're not more or less civilized. But what I would say is that technology, I think, can be, in a way, something that saves us from ourselves. Everyone's talking about technology as being all doom and gloom, but actually, there's many things about it that can actually save us in terms of just helping us see the error of our ways, and even in a sense, but also solutions to problems, global problems. Anyway, I won't go on. Let's get into the slides. Um, just a disclaimer that, of course, this is, and especially because I probably am going to post this publicly at some point as well, even though I'm just sharing this with patrons initially. I don't know, actually, I might not post it publicly ultimately. I don't know. I'll have to make a decision about that. But it is for entertainment purposes only. We kind of have to say that on YouTube land. So basically, it's all kind of just entertainment for our minds in a way. And actually, even though I'm saying that in jest in one way, it's very true in another way, that anything I say here about any year in the future and whatever might transpire, it's all just the mind stuff. It's not real. We're just sitting here, you're sitting there listening to this wherever you are, and that's what's real. That's the only thing that's real. So I think really take that into account when you're thinking about all these big things. Calculations I use are sidereal, and I'll maybe repeat that a couple of times just to hammer that home, but just so you know, I don't use the tropical zodiac in this regard. And I use the Chitra Paksha, it's called the Ayan Amsha, the 24-degree difference between the tropical and sidereal at this time. And I'm going to use the true nodes for this presentation. I normally use the true nodes for transits. And then when I'm doing client work, I use the mean nodes and sometimes the true nodes as well, if they're on the cusp. But for transits, I generally use the true nodes these days. So to just kick things off before we get into the astrology of the next decade and the World War astrology, just a reminder that, and this is something my teacher Pearl Finn used to tell us in class many, many years ago, and she would remind us whatever we've got going on in our little lives, that basically our Milky Way is on a collision course with the Andromeda galaxy. So the Andromeda and Milky Way galaxies are going to collide in about 4.5 billion years. And this is obviously just hypothetical images of what might happen. Um, but if you can just have that, wrap your head around that in a sense, whatever's going on this planet, in even our solar system and even the galaxy, our galaxy is eventually going to collide with another, and that's it. So whatever we think about what's happening on the planet, maybe just keep it in perspective. So there is, though, striking correlations between the astrology of the 2020s and that of the period between both world wars, like condensed form of what happened between World War One and World War Two. And I've been saying this for a few years now because the astrology has been quite striking, just jam-packed into 10 years. That's both good and bad news. Good news in that it's over with quickly. So it's not going to go on for years and years and years. Bad news in that it's going to be, quick and sharp and shocking, I guess, to the system, the world system, the world order, whatever. I do think it's going to have more of a shock and impact on the global economic system more than anything else. But I don't know to what degree. I mean, look, it's already happening, so there's no point again kind of pussyfooting around the issue here. There is a lot going on right now. There are wars as we speak. So we're going to talk more about this. So let me just show you, first of all, the chart for the beginning of World War One. And let's just look at these charts of World War One and Two and what they might have in common with this period, and also the differences, because there's a lot of differences as well, obviously. And so this is the chart for 1914. So, well, basically, I mean, one of the main things, of course, was that Saturn conjoined Pluto in Gemini. And Saturn-Pluto conjunctions either show these kinds of big events, or like we had in the most recent Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which wasn't a war as such, it was a war on this virus that we had in 2020. So 2020 was the last time we had this conjunction. And it's not like it's that rare a conjunction, but when, it's in these signs in particular, this particular Gemini division, especially where Saturn and Pluto were moving into Ardra, this, very turbulent, warlike lunar mansion in the middle of Gemini, which is ruled by a fierce form of Shiva, the god of destruction, called Rudra. He's a fierce, angry god. So the deities have an impact here, of course, in the Vedic pantheon. So this was one of the reasons, not the only reason. The other big reason, and I want to draw your attention to it, and for next year, is the Mars-Ketu conjunction. Mars and Ketu is the south node of the moon, and north node is Rahu. Mars and Ketu came together in sidereal Leo. They are going to come together again in sidereal Leo next year, June of 2025. That's for me a red flag already. So, but before you start freaking out, though, again, we don't have a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. We've already had it. That's gone. We are going to have a Saturn-Pluto square in the coming years, so that's another thing to keep an eye on, but we'll look at these transits. So it's not sort of all coming together. In this period for World War One, it all came together. It was a real sort of trigger point, obviously. Saturn-Pluto is big enough on its own, but then when you have this Mars-Ketu conjunction and then throw Venus into the mix, and therefore Venus, the peacekeeper, wasn't able to keep the peace, essentially. So also on top of everything else, then you had Jupiter and Capricorn in debilitation, as we did in 2020. We won't have it again until 2032, but that's something to bear in mind because, again, I'm talking about really more so the period from the beginning, end of 2029, let's say 29, 30, 31, 32, that area. And so Jupiter is going to go back into Capricorn and meet with Pluto this next time. So there were a few things here that triggered this war. And I can show you the charts now as well, which I'll do in a minute, and just show you the maybe period before and after and sort of around it, because that's important as well, because wars, again, don't just crop out of nowhere. This is the beginning of World War II then in 1939. September, I believe, of 1939. And we see here that Saturn and Ketu, the south node, and Uranus all met in sidereal Aries, aspected by Mars from Capricorn in exaltation. So this is problematic because this is one of the signatures of the next decade, the beginning of the 2030s. Saturn, Ketu, and Uranus are all going to meet, not in Aries this time, but in Taurus. But in that sense, you might think, okay, it's a repeating pattern somewhat. Yeah, but it's not Aries, thankfully. But it's still not good either because it's in Taurus. And when Saturn has an impact on signs, it tends to kind of blunt the sign in a way. It might also create havoc in other ways. But when we're talking about them coming together in Taurus by the end of the decade into the next decade, 2030s, we're talking about Taurus being impacted in a bigger way. That's why I'm thinking the war that's coming is more like an economic issue, more about resources and literally supply chains, like, and power and energy being supplied to people. And because we're so connected into a grid right now, it's so easy to disrupt that. And it's going to be very disrupted, I think, by the beginning of the 2030s. So this is World War II. It was just pure, straightforward war, Aries, Mars, brute force. Again, Mars was aspecting this Saturn, which was retrograde as well, conjunct Ketu and Uranus there. This is just highly volatile. If I saw this in a person's chart, in a birth chart, this is like very volatile, and to be like looking at addressing this Aries sign and what it represented for them and how they could manage it better. So in the world, obviously, this wasn't managed. It was a highly volatile period. But then the key thing about this is, and this is where I'm going to show you the other charts, or I'm going to show you the time periods around both world wars. What happened, obviously, subsequently is that Saturn did move into Taurus with Uranus, which is what's going to happen again. So it wasn't like World War II happened in a year or two and then it's gone. It escalated from Aries into Taurus. And then as soon as Taurus got activated, the US became involved in the war, and so on and so on. And I'm sure your history around the wars. So there's a point to be made here about Aries leading to Taurus, i.e. wars leading to famines, i.e. wars leading to shortages and rationing, and Aries to Taurus. So it just seems though that the next war is going to be more about the Taurus side of things, because that's where they're all going to begin to meet. And then they're going to actually move on into Gemini. So what good we could take from that, maybe we could see a silver lining, is that maybe there's a sort of more of an economic issue. Yes, there's fighting, of course, but it doesn't seem to be full on Aries territory in one sense. Yes, of course, Saturn is going to go through Aries mid-decade, mid-2020s, I mean, but it's on its own in a sense for a lot of that time. And historically, and even just looking at the last two Saturn transits in Aries recently, like the beginning of the end of 1960s, beginning of 1970s, and again in the late 1990s, 2000 mark. That was the last time Saturn was in Aries. We didn't have wars. You don't have wars every time Saturn goes into Aries. You have to have a lot of other things going on. And actually, let me actually remind you that if you're not familiar with these historic events, actually the IRA ceasefire happened with a Saturn in Aries. So the point here to be made is that actually Saturn on its own in Aries could actually dampen down wars, because Saturn is about slowing something down, actually. And Aries is about war. So if you put Saturn in Aries, it can slow down war. So that's why I'm thinking that mid-decade, this decade, we could see a slowdown in wars initially. But then as Saturn goes on into Taurus and then meets with Uranus in Taurus, and then Ketu joins them, this is the problem. It's going to be this configuration again, but this time in Taurus. 2029, 2030, 31. That's a whole period you need to be mindful of, I would say. So actually, let me share my charts. So this is the charts for World War One and World War Two. This is World War One. Let me just move it back like a few years, forward a few years. You can see how all of this developed. So if for this chart for World War One, Saturn and Pluto came together in Gemini, Mars and Ketu came together in Leo. Let's just move it back a year and see that Saturn and Mars were together in Taurus. Okay, so on its own, maybe not such a problem. It is a problem, generally, Mars-Saturn conjunctions. But on its own, certainly not war. But then move it back another year, not a problem. Another year, though, we've got Saturn and Mars coming together again, but this time with Rahu, the north node, and Ketu, the south node, with Jupiter opposite Saturn. This is another thing to mention about the upcoming transits when Jupiter itself opposes Saturn, which they will oppose again later on this decade. That's like a testing opposition usually, especially after whatever has begun during their conjunction, and their conjunction was in 2020. So there's something else going on here, as there was prior to World War One, and a build-up, you can say, with these kinds of configurations before the war. So that's again a couple of years, 3 years before the war, and then moving forward again 3 years. This is the actual war, and then afterwards you can see that how things can continue to develop. And this is like a few years after the war, 1917. What happened obviously after World War One, of course, was the Spanish flu. I mean, what happened then was, of course, is that the nodes moved into Gemini Sagittarius, which is problematic usually, and it's going to happen again by the end of this decade. This is why I keep saying it's end of decade where all of the issues are sort of crammed into. Ketu in Gemini and Rahu in Sagittarius, they're said to be in their fall or in debilitation, according to many astrologers, and for good reason. I won't go through all of them now, but they tend to, especially in these lunar mansions, create wars and things and pandemics and so on. And this was leading to the Spanish flu after World War One. And what can you say? You've got Ketu and Mars come together again, 1917, 1918. They'd moved out, but then of course Ketu goes into Taurus. That's the issue here, is that you've got Ketu moving out of its fall in one way, but according to other astrologers, Ketu is now in its fall, its true fall, its debilitation in Taurus, and Rahu in Scorpio. So now, whether you believe that they're debilitated in Gemini or Taurus, the whole while they're moving through these signs for 3 years, over 3 years, you've got this situation where the nodes are behaving in a more extreme way. And again, because we're going to have Ketu return to Taurus by the end of the decade, into the next decade, and then also conjoin Saturn and Uranus, that's a lot more problematic. So that's World War One and the whole era after that, and of course then the Spanish flu and all of that. This is World War Two, beginning of. Ketu had moved through in years prior Gemini and Taurus, and it had reached Aries. And let's not forget that Ketu has to obviously reach Aries at this time as well, by the end of the decade into next decade. And you would say, okay, if we haven't got a problem in Gemini, then it's in Taurus, but then in Aries. So it's like one after the other is a problem until Ketu gets to Pisces, where by many estimations, Ketu is said to be ruler. It's in a really poor situation the whole way along, Gemini, Taurus, Aries. So in this case, it was the beginning of World War II. Ketu had made its way to Aries and met with Saturn, which made its way into Aries from the other direction, and Uranus there too. And so also let me remind you, and I'll remind you of all these dates again anyway with slides, so just in case, this is all a bit too much to take in right now. But Uranus moved into Aries in 2016, and it's just moved out temporarily. It's going to move back in this year, December of 2024, until March 2025, and then go back into Taurus for 7 years. So this is, again, a repeat of what happened during World War One. And I'll talk more as well about the US and how the US is implicated in this and how it's likely going to be dragged into a bigger, wider scale war, a more direct war, you might say, because you could say that the US are at war, but we're now calling it, I guess, and I don't think it's controversy to call it this now anymore, a proxy war. And that just simply means that the US are at war with another country, but through the agency of a third party. So, i.e., Ukraine or Israel. So again, that's not controversy. That's just plain fact that when you have a country supplying a country with arms to bomb another country, then that's, you could say, a proxy war, essentially. So this was very problematic, obviously, during World War One. I'm not going to go into obviously the whole historic, what happened with Hitler and all of that. I mean, you can obviously read about it if you don't already know about all of this. But astrologically, Mars exalted aspecting Aries was the beginning of many years of, and then as they move through Taurus, again together, as we'll have again, Saturn, Uranus in Taurus. There was, yeah, obviously what happened. I do think the US is particularly implicated here, and I'll show you the chart for the US. As soon as Uranus and Saturn move back into Taurus again, and that will be by the end of the decade, this decade. So it's just a repeat of what happened in the 1940s then. So if we move this forward just a few years, we see that when the US entered the war, Pearl Harbor and all of that happened with Uranus and Jupiter and Saturn all were in Taurus. Mars had joined them then at some point as well. So yeah, it was just one trigger after the other. And that's my point here, I guess, is that world wars don't come out of nowhere. When something is begun, whether it's a country that's, you know, bombing another country or whatever it is, that has to go somewhere. That doesn't just peter out and we just say, oh, forget about it. Because, you might say individually we can do that, like turn the other cheek. Yes, maybe individually, but not globally. Globally, we are at our worst in humanity. When you put just a group of people together, they behave at their worst. So this is what wars are. Essentially, you take the worst of humanity and explode it into this kind of situations with this astrology, especially. So let me go back to the slides because I want to go on with the story of these wars, I suppose, but the role as well of the outer planets. And this is something that a lot of Vedic astrologers don't use at all. But I think without using them, you can't really see what's happening long term. You can see the sort of more short-term triggers for sure, but you're not going to get the bigger picture here. So the role of the outer planets, Neptune, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, are an absolute must. So Uranus, first of all, a reminder, it went into sidereal Aries 2016 and will until 2025 March. And it will be in Taurus from 2025 until 2032. And like I said, it is going to meet with Saturn while it's in Taurus, but then it will also continue into Gemini with Saturn. So that's an ongoing story from Taurus to Gemini. But thankfully not Aries, so like it was in World War One. So it's not Uranus, Saturn, and Ketu all in Aries. It's just Uranus, or it was just Uranus. Now you might say, well, just Uranus on its own, it still created all the many wars we're seeing on the planet right now. And it has. And this notion of surprise attacks is another thing. And again, another thing about, for example, Pearl Harbor, again, Uranus, Jupiter, and Taurus. That was a Uranus Jupiter conjunction in Taurus. So don't think that, oh, as soon as Uranus gets into Taurus, then that's all peace and good times. No, it's not. It's disruptive, Uranus. That's its nature. So it will disrupt Taurus and stability, therefore, and the economy. And so Uranus was in Taurus during the American independence chart, which I'll show you. But yeah, it's a signature for it. And every time Uranus was in Taurus, historically, the US has either been at war or in a civil war or in its founding war, which is the War of Independence. So every single iteration of Uranus and Taurus has meant the US has been at war. And why would this one be any different? I'd ask you. I don't think so. It's just to what degree and what kind of war that is, we don't know yet. But it's on the cusp, let's say, of this war with Uranus moving in and out of Taurus this year and next year. And again, by March next year, 2025, it's moving in again and staying in for the next 7 years. So that's Uranus. Neptune. Neptune in Pisces is this sort of propaganda and fog of war, as it's termed. So it's a lot of confusion that's created during times of war, obviously. People, on both sides, just all this propaganda, they want to obviously have the upper hand and use information and all of that, especially in Pisces, because Pisces is very much about the truth and it gets a bit misty and foggy with Neptune and Pisces. So we're not 100% clear about what's true. And just a reminder also that Neptune was in Pisces during the American Civil War. So there's a lot of sort of propaganda and misinformation that fuels people's really strongly held beliefs that then lead to war. So, like I said earlier, a lot of war is about resource and fighting over resource, but it's also about beliefs. It's a lot to do with what people believe. So that's Neptune. Pluto, obviously a big player in war, and it moved into Capricorn in 2020. It will be there till 2040. It is a Pluto return for the American independence chart. So Pluto is in Capricorn in 1776. So this is the next time, the one and only time for the American independence chart that it's returned. It's the first time it's returned to where it was. So it's like another, I don't know, fight for independence or fight for, as they're saying nowadays, fight for democracy. And it's another big part of war because, of course, it's Pluto and it's like the god of the underworld and of death, you might say. So, and many Vedic astrologers call Capricorn the sign of the graveyard. And that's a very, very bleak view of the sign Capricorn, obviously. But they use that analogy for a very good reason. I mean, it is lorded by Saturn, but Pluto in Capricorn and Pluto and Saturn's conjunction in Capricorn in 2020, of course, showed that pandemic. When Saturn moves into Aries, it will square Pluto and Capricorn. And that's what might be a bit more worrisome in terms of just a typical Saturn moving through Aries kind of transit. This time it's a square to Pluto. So that does pose a challenge in terms of what began in 2020. So whether that's, I'm really hesitant to say anything around a pandemic because I don't know about that. But again, if we keep this on track in terms of war, we could think about it in other ways, and wars fought differently. A war, it's like that notion of a war on for your mind, you know? And I think again, adding to the propaganda and all of that with Neptune and Pisces and the confusion, um, this is troublesome because Pluto and Capricorn over many, many years is this complete dismantling of the current world order. And whether it's in America, whether it's with the economy, or both likely, whether it's in just the world order and how all of these different, factions are like gathering on two sides of this apparent gulf. This is a slow erosion process with Pluto and Capricorn. It's not going to happen overnight. But it's continuing to happen during this whole phase between 2020 and 2040. So let's get maybe kind of down to a more immediate time frame. So the Vedic astrologer Narisa Rao, he is I think in the US actually in the US, but he's an Indian astrologer. He makes world predictions quite a lot. He has already predicted World War by 2030, 2032. I initially heard his prediction and my ears pricked up and I thought, okay, let's have a look at this. Let's investigate this more. He was basing it solely, it seemed, on Saturn and Ketu and their conjunction in sidereal Taurus, but also the lunar mansion Rohini in the middle of Taurus, which he said correlated with the Great War of the epic Mahabharata. So I don't know how he makes that correlation because, of course, that's an ancient myth and story. But the point here is that I take his point that Saturn and Ketu, which tend to remove things, moving into Taurus and especially Rohini, which is about comforts in life, this shows that there's some removal of these comforts and challenge to our everyday kind of basics even. And again, I'm thinking like energy supplies, food production, the whole world system and energy grid and all of that, and how that's going to be impacted by 2030 to 2032 during this conjunction. I would also again add the Uranus conjunction because he didn't mention Uranus, but Uranus is there as well in Taurus conjunct these two. And again, it's in the same as the independence chart in Taurus, Uranus in Taurus. So it's a huge, big deal. By the way, Saturn was in Taurus at the time when as an example, all of the overhead wires were installed in the US and supplied electricity in the US for the first time. So what we all know nowadays is like electricity. It's just we take it for granted, right? That was a Saturn in Taurus transit. Now we have Saturn, Ketu, Uranus in Taurus. I mean, if it's not a disruption to energy and the supply chains and the energy grid, I mean, maybe it's in a good way. Let's hope that it's a good way. Let's hope that actually they completely overhaul the energy system and maybe even come up with a different energy system. I don't know, that's maybe pie in the sky thinking, but who knows? I don't want to be all bleak about this. I do think there's going to be some massive upheavals, though, in terms of Taurus type of things. So why Taurus is so important, and leading on from Aries, remember, is that it is very much about comforts and stability and safety and security. And if you take that away from people, they will fight. If you leave people with their Taurus things, nobody's going to fight. So essentially, that's what happens really with Taurus. It represents, obviously, with these transits, disruptions in basics, and we have to be really mindful of this. And this whole notion of this Cold War era, we are already in that era. People are already saying this, using this term again. So the divisions in the world are especially now being developed around the whole sort of like the BRICS nations and then other nations, and the whole economic system being challenged right now. The potential here, and as I said, the story leads from Aries to Taurus in direct order, usually, except for the nodes. And again, in this case, it would be Ketu moving back from Taurus to Aries, while all the other planets, Saturn and Uranus, are moving forward from Aries to Taurus, and they'll all converge in Taurus. The whole story is rationing because of wars. And that's hopefully not something that's going to happen into any great extent. But I mean, the thing is, it is happening. And if you're blind to that, I mean, I don't know where you've been living, but obviously we can see what's happening in Gaza. We can see what's happening in Sudan. We can see what happens in all of these countries that are having wars. There's like a long list at this point. And what happens is, of course, you can't, go about your everyday stuff, and you can't get the supplies you need. And, then you see famines and all of these things even. So this is the story of Aries to Taurus. Saturn and Uranus transit Taurus, as I mentioned, but also Gemini. And that would mean that the whole period is from 2030 to 2034, actually. I know that Narisa Morau says 2030 to 32 as a world war potential, but like they're together for 4 years because they're going to meet in one sign, and then Uranus is going to move in with Saturn to Gemini. So it seems to be in another way dragged out a little bit more. But again, the upside of this, I would say, is that it's not Aries they're starting in Taurus and moving on into Gemini. Whereas before World War I, it was starting in Aries and moving on into Taurus. So this might be a somewhat silver lining here, that it might not be too catastrophic and might just be about supply chains and the economy and the change and all of the systems and the economy and all of that, and how that impacts our day-to-day life, and Gemini and our interactions and our communications and our travel and so on and so on. But we do have to consider, obviously, cyber attacks and the drone attacks that we're seeing more and more of, and disruptions to our monetary system, obviously. But what about Mars? Obviously, Mars, we have to talk about Mars because Mars is the god of war. And I've been talking a lot about Aries, which is a more sort of outright sort of sign of war, even in terms of Aries, the Greek god of war. But, you don't want to discount Scorpio's role either. And, in modern astrology, the Pluto role in that sense, because it correlated with Scorpio. But certainly we have to think about Mars itself, the planet Mars. What's it doing? Now, Mars is a fast mover, so it moves through the zodiac every couple of years, and every couple of years is going to go retrograde as well. But this is one of the key things that I've noted over the years from major attacks and escalation wars, and you've seen it already a couple of times, is Mars conjunct Ketu. Mars conjunct Ketu, the south node of the moon, is problematic. And the last time it happened was, of course, October 2023. So that was the attack in Israel. I thought it was going to be an economic thing, Libra, Venus, money related. But it was the attack in Israel. Now, it isn't to say that that isn't part of the story, the longer story of an economic issue, because they're going to come together again next year, June of 2025, in Leo. And remember, that's where they were during the beginning of World War I. So that's a problem. And I think we have to be mindful of that even now and what's happening now, because Mars is currently aspecting Ketu by square aspect. And that's, in a way, a trigger for what happens next year, June 2025. They come together again, November 2026, and they'll conjoin Jupiter that time as well in Leo. And there's this whole retrograde thing going on between Leo and Cancer, which is very complicated. 26, 27, March, April 27, they're in Cancer, conjunct Jupiter. This is very explosive, really explosive. But they'll do again later on in Gemini, Mars in Gemini, conjunct Ketu, and then they'll get into Taurus by 2030. This is problematic because, again, this is the Saturn and Uranus conjunction in Taurus with Ketu and Mars then as well. So this summer of 2030 looks particularly challenging in terms of wars. but then they're going to go into Aries because again, remember that Mars goes around the zodiac every couple of years, but then Ketu's moving back through the zodiac every year and a half. It moves sign. So now they're going to come together in Aries by 2032. And then Jupiter would be debilitated in Capricorn. So this for me is a big, huge downturn after probably war. And so we have to be really mindful, I guess, of this whole period. And this is, me working this out in terms of these transits, thinking again about what Nerissa Morau said about 2030 to 2032, you could definitely see the correlation here as well, adding in Uranus and Jupiter and Capricorn. And so Jupiter and Capricorn, by the way, just to remind you, if you're not familiar, Jupiter and Capricorn tends to show downturn economically more so like a constriction. The planet of growth, Jupiter, in its fall, in its debilitation. But at the same time as a Mars-Ketu conjunction, that would seem to be more problematic, I would say. And of course, 12 years prior to this was 2020. And that was the last major downturn economically because of the lockdowns. So this whole period for sure, I mean, the whole decade you can see in a way is problematic in some way or other. But I do think because of other transits, I think there's going to be a bit of a lull mid-decade, like I said. And then by the end of the decade, it's picking up again into more volatility and a lot more by the early 2030s. So let's go on with this Saturn in Aries notion, because you might think that, okay, Saturn in Aries, is that not problematic for war? In a way it is, and I've looked at that transit quite a lot, and it has meant a lot of issues, obviously in terrorist attacks and all of these things, but it also has meant like peace treaties. Like I said, one example was the IRA peace treaty, Good Friday Agreement, was when Saturn was in Aries. It can sometimes actually show a dampening down of the Aries impulse. So we have to kind of take that as well as maybe a more positive expression of this. Now it's still Mars' sign, and Saturn is said to be debilitated in Aries. It doesn't like it there. And again, it's in a square to Pluto next time around, so it's going to move in 2027 initially, then in 2028 to 29, and then go back into 20 by the end of 29 and into 2030. So it's going to move in and out quite a bit. And this is not usually seen as a positive thing in one way, because when a planet moves in and out of a sign, it's kind of like it's initially kind of starts something, but then it doesn't. And then it gets started properly, and then you think it's over, but it's not. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth and ups and downs the whole decade because of this, in a sense. So as much as I'm saying I think there might be a lull in fighting mid-decade with Saturn in Aries, it's also problematic and leading especially into the conjunctions later on in Taurus. And of course, goes into Taurus after Aries, right? In 2030. But it's initially going to go in, in 2029. So I think 2029 is where I'm looking at as the major sort of escalation point. And I'll again show you that more as well. So this is Saturn and Taurus conjoining, again, remember Uranus and Ketu, August 29 to October initially, but then again from 2030, April until May 30, 2032. I mean, that whole phase is problematic, essentially. Uranus, like I said, is in Taurus throughout that period. So it's their conjunction, really, that's the problem. And then again, Ketu is there as well. And again, it's their conjunction. And then Ketu then after Taurus goes into Aries. So it's just the whole end of the decade, beginning of next decade is problematic, as you can see. And now let's throw another one into the mix, as if that weren't enough, all of that. You might not think of Venus is in any way involved in any way in war, but it is. And it was and has been historically involved in the Russia story, especially, and the Russia-Ukraine story, especially. And this is actually the one reason I was able to predict that Russia would invade Ukraine, was because of Venus. It was because of everything else that was going on around it, but especially because of Venus and where it was. And where it was in Sagittarius in Purva Ashada, which is very much about what people say are declarations of war. And it was retrograde there. And every 8 years, it retrogrades in this same place. And so 8 years prior to its invasion of Ukraine was when it invaded Crimea. And prior to that, and so on and so on. You can look back historically, there's a big tie with Russia and Ukraine and Venus. So that means that the next time Venus goes retrograde in December 2029 and January 2030 in the same section of the zodiac is going to trigger something again with the whole Russia-Ukraine story. So you have to add that into the mix of what's already going on in the world now, which is probably escalated again or begun to escalate again by the end of the decade. Oh, on top of everything else, then you have this Jupiter-Saturn opposition, which is again tying that back into the conjunction story that happened in 2020, and that's a whole other thing going on. So who knows what that's about? But usually Saturn, Jupiter conjoining, squaring as they are right now as I speak, and then also opposing shows this boom bust situation always. Jupiter and Saturn is always boom bust. So who knows? We just have to factor that in as well. So this is the chart for Venus retrograde in 2030. 2930, remember. So I'm putting it in here for January 2030. So it's retrograde here. Again, this Purva Ashada, which is a very warlike lunar mansion here in Sagittarius, in the middle of Sagittarius. And it's conjoined Rahu as well, which is finishing up in Sagittarius, which is in debilitation in Sagittarius, according to many, but then moving into Scorpio, which is again debilitated, according to many others. So you've just got this problem here. And then Scorpio, which is self-ruled by Mars, and Mars is exalted at this time as well, and squaring Saturn, remember. And this is the exact Saturn-Mars square that I'm highlighting here. And then Ketu in Gemini. This is problematic. Saturn opposite Jupiter. This is 2030. This is problematic. And even if it's not war problematic, it's problematic. Again, boom bust, issues in the economy, issues with fighting, especially all of the above. And then some, I would say. There's just going to be a lot of issues going on at this time. So the whole question though is, what will it be called World War III? Will it be World War? We might not call World War III and for many, many years, but what kind of war would it be? I mentioned this already. And this potential again, and I do see this as a potential as almost like a deferral, and maybe again Saturn in Aries kind of almost in a way Saturn being the sort of like unexpected sort of hero of the story, where in Aquarius, for example, right now, it's sort of like assuaged many things that could have been escalated over these last few years because of its aspects. But in Aries, it could just dampen down the war impulse, from mid-decade. So yeah, that could be, definitely a sort of like Pollyanna-ish way of looking at it for sure, because Saturn in Aries is problematic in so many other ways. But I'm thinking even other things, like problems with Saturn are borders in other ways. And I'm thinking climate catastrophe issues that are so big that you cannot have a war actually, because you got to deal with this issue. So this is another reason why I'm thinking that it could be deferred almost. But it also could be other issues like uprisings. I do see, I made a separate video about that, like revolutions, uprisings in Russia and different places, in the US. I don't know what that's going to look like, but the astrology, I'm not going to go through it here. It looks like that kind of revolutionary kind of stance mid-decade. So when things are falling apart in another way, which is what Saturn is doing in the next few years, by the way, it's going to move into Pisces from 2025, conjoin Neptune. Then it's going to go into Aries in debilitation. It's like everything's falling apart in the next few years in another way. And I don't know if you can have a war when you can't even manage your own country. But then other people say, well, when countries are starting to fall apart, they want to have a sort of a war to kind of prop them up in a way. It's like a money machine, right? So I don't know. Lots of opinions on this. The astrology, though, is quite volatile this whole time. I'm just hoping that the other Saturn Aries expression will be that dampening down effect, basically. And the other more positive maybe thing about, adapting as we always do. But these days, as I mentioned in the beginning, technology allowing us to adapt and progress and innovate in ways that we just couldn't have in the past, in previous world wars. So let's go through some charts. And then I'll take your questions because I know I threw a lot at you there, and I might also bring up their charts for questions in the software that I shared with you earlier, and we can look at different things in the chart if you want to have, a more in-depth discussion. But just for this recording, I'll just give you the charts. I'm just going to give you a few. This is the Russia chart. No surprise that we have Cancer rising for this particular chart, and Cancer itself being impacted by Pluto in the opposite sign where Saturn is in this sign. And so Pluto is right on this Saturn right now in this period, I mean. And so it's this disintegration essentially of their international relations. That's essentially what happens when you have in a country's chart Pluto transit the seventh house. It's a breakdown, that's what Pluto does, of relations. So I don't need to say any more about that. I don't think it's also a square to its own natal Pluto. You can see here Ketu and Rahu are in these signs that I keep referring to as problematic for the nodes, and so much more. You could always talk about these charts at length, but again, I'll leave it to you to ask questions if you want to look at any of these particular charts. Next chart is Ukraine itself, opposite. This is the chart for Ukraine, Capricorn rising, Moon and Saturn in Capricorn. This is where Pluto moved in 2020. And again, what's happened there subsequently is no surprise that this is where all of the action is happening in Capricorn, with Pluto at least. And I think, again, like, the correlation as well between Ukraine and Russia, and this opposite sign effect as well. And the nodes, again, obviously there's a lot of correlations here. It's not a too dissimilar sign or chart. You've got Pluto again in a square to its position. So again, Ukraine, this was the invasion of Ukraine. Venus had finished its retrograde here in Purva Ashada. And it had moved actually into Uttarashada, the latter lunar mansion here at the very end of Sagittarius when they invaded. And then you can see here Mars had joined Venus as well, almost by degree. And so again, it's a very warlike sign anyway, Sagittarius. People often don't think about Sagittarius in that way, but it is. It's very much about warring for beliefs. Anyway, won't get into all of that. Again, you can see that a lot of the signature was the Saturn-Pluto ongoing story at the time as well. The next chart is the American chart. And I know that a lot of people watching this, even patrons following me for a while, will think, why am I using Scorpio all of a sudden? The only reason that I was using Sagittarius for the US for many years is because James Kelleher was the astrologer who rectified, I don't know how, but somehow rectified the US chart and said that it had Sagittarius rising using a 6:30 p.m. time. However, most astrologers on the planet use 10 past 5 as the time for the declaration. So that is tropical Sagittarius, fair enough, but it's going to be Scorpio, sidereal Scorpio. So I started using this like a year or two, maybe just a year ago now, and it really fits much better, I think. Everything fits much better, but even just the fact that this is actually the correct time to use. So I don't know what James Kelleher was doing when he put in 6:30 p.m., why he would rectify the time, because it's different. Like, why would you rectify a time for something like that that's been reported extensively on? It's different if you have a time of birth for a person that you're not sure of and you want to rectify it because you don't know what time they were born. This is a country, and we know it's been documented when these things were signed. So this is the Scorpio rising, sidereal Scorpio. It places Pluto in the third sign of war. But again, as I've been saying, this proxy war, Pluto is hidden. And then it's hidden more so by Ketu in the third sign. These are two hidden aspects, Ketu and Pluto. And they're not going to outright, necessarily always go to war. But they are in a proxy war right now. And Pluto has returned here in the third sign. All of these other planets are then placed in the eighth sign, including Mars. Sun is here as well. There's a lot going on here, but again, I'll draw your attention to Uranus in Taurus, which is returning next year, 2025. It's there initially, and it's going to go back in December until March next year, 25. So this is another trigger. And like I said, every single time Uranus has been in Taurus in US history, this was the beginning of the US. This was the fight for freedom and Civil War and World War II. Every time Uranus has been in Taurus, and this is now the fourth time, I guess, this is the fourth time and the fourth war, likely, whether it's a civil war, whether it's infighting, or whether it's another external war, or whether it's just going to always be a proxy war. I don't know, but it is fighting. It is war. So that's the US. This is Israel. Most people use Libra, sidereal. The nodes are obviously highly impacting this chart. And also that conjunction of Mars and Ketu in Libra triggered the attack. So Mars and Ketu conjoined in October 2023 in the sign Libra, where Ketu is in this chart in the rising sign. So, that's kind of almost straightforward. I just wanted to show you that. This is the attack, Mars and Ketu in Libra. And this was the actual time of the attack, by the way, the exact time of the attack on Israel, with Libra just having begun rising, with Mars and Ketu in Libra. So Uranus again in the seventh sign, Uranus in the seventh sign, just like in the US chart, it's not necessarily in a country's chart the easiest because it disrupts relations, essentially. That's why there's a war. It hampers relations, international relations. So Another couple of countries, though, I'm going to throw at you, which I didn't mention at all because we have to consider it because, of course, there's a war raging in the Middle East right now and also in Ukraine. But of course, that implicates, Iran. I'm also even going to mention China, but these charts are impacted. Now, look again, Cancer is rising in the Iranian chart I have. Jupiter is in Cancer. They are obviously impacted by these transits, and also even more immediately, Mars is retrograde in Cancer at the end of this year is something to be mindful of. I'm not going to talk too much about this chart because, I haven't really talked a lot about Iran in this presentation, but I do think that there are triggers in this chart, and this Saturn gets triggered as well in the years to come in the second house, and the nodes therefore are triggered in these signs, and the nodes will transit opposing these placements. Ketu is going to move into Leo, conjunct Rahu or Mars, remember, in June of 2023. There's some triggers in this chart for sure. And there's a lot of ninth house activation here as well. Mars and the Sun and Mercury are here in the ninth. Jupiter exalted in the first. It's a very obviously religious state and fighting over beliefs more than anything else in Iran. And then finally, China. And again, we've got Capricorn rising. So you can see the bigger story here is the story of Pluto. And if you can't see that, if you don't look at the outer planets, you're not going to see this bigger picture. That these signs, Capricorn and Cancer, and all of these countries I've shown you with these rising signs are implicated. And it breaks things down. It destroys things, Pluto. So now Pluto is in the rising sign and the moon sign of the Chinese chart. This is a good chart we have for China, People's Republic of China. And it's in the process. It's in the very slow, again, process of breaking China apart in a way, I think. I do think that there's going to be some uprisings to come in China in the years to come. I think there's going to be, I could show you the chart of Xi Jinping. He has a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Virgo. There's a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Pisces next year, next few years. I do think he's going to be challenged in his leadership. Mars is going to retrograde again in Cancer by the end of the year. It is in the seventh sign with Pluto in this chart. This is problematic even in the short term over the winter. So I do think over the next few months, it's a testing time in China as well. So you got to add that in because, of course, we're not just talking about these isolated wars. We're talking about world war. So we have to talk about all of these regions. But at any rate, might seem like a silly little prayer to add in at the end here with all of I've said, but I do think it's important that we consider the worst, prepare for the worst, perhaps, and hope for the best, as they say. But we have to also pray. I do think that we can add our own prayers into, the pot, as it were, and do whatever you can yourself personally. And even if it feels like you're doing nothing, saying a prayer is something, you know, um, and it's something for your own peace of mind, I would say. So just saying simply any chance, any prayers you have yourself in your own tradition, or just Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Just pray for peace, everybody. Thank you for watching. My website is timelineastrology.com if you'd like to go there and find out more about me. Again, I'm not actually sure if I'm going to post this publicly anyway, so it's all a moot point, but I might. I'll see how I feel about it. I don't want to put any more fear out there than there is already. And those that are watching kind of follow me anyway, and they know my opinions on this. They're more prepared in a way for the astrology, and it's not like a bolt out of the blue for them. But if you're coming across this video and I have posted it and you've kind of felt a bit blown over by all of that astrology, just again, remember what I said at the top of this, that it is all for entertainment purposes. It's all entertainment for the mind. It's not real in another way. As in only what's happening right now in your body, in your breath, what's happening right now for you, wherever you are listening to this. That's the only thing that's real. Everything else is a mind thing. So just remember that. One last thing before I leave it. This is the next presentation I'm going to do because obviously on the foot of that, I want to do something a bit more hopeful, if not even like utopian. But of course, we have to consider this view of this dystopian view that we all have in a way, and we might not admit to it, but we all have it because it's been fed to us in many ways of the future versus a utopian view of the future and how we have to balance these things out in our mind. Because if we go to any extreme, we're likely to fall into the other. So in other words, if you're going to go to dystopian in your mind, a dystopia obviously is not real, right? But if you go there in your mind, you're going to flip at some point into a utopia because you just cannot live in a dystopia in your mind, I mean. But likewise, if you're going to go to a utopia in your mind, that is going to eventually crash down into a dystopia, because you cannot keep that pretense up in a way as well, because it's just like a vision of the future that's not real either. So we have to find a middle ground here, essentially. And the middle ground is a tricky one because it's the journey, as I've said here, from Scorpio to Aquarius. And because essentially Scorpio is the dystopia and Aquarius the utopia, they're the trickiest signs of the zodiac. Wherever they are placed in our charts, we have the hardest time with. Let's call a spade a spade. They are ruled by the two malefic planets as well as the nodes in the Vedic tradition. So you've got Scorpio ruled by Mars, and you've got Ketu ruling it, the south node. And even modern times they call Pluto the ruler. So now you've got all of these really malefic planets ruling Scorpio. And then Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, the other malefic, and Rahu, the north node of the moon in Vedic tradition. And then in modern times, you've got Uranus, the disruptor. So these two signs are absolutely the most challenging. And we have to deal with them. And if we don't deal with them and we bury it, then we have issues. So this presentation is all about how can we navigate this journey, this complex journey between one to the other without negating one or the other. So I hope you join me for that. I'll post more about it when it's upcoming. And thank you for joining me. And I'll take questions now from anyone who's here live. And I'll just stop recording for now. So thanks, everyone.